Hi, dear friends. It's time to read. God's grace keeps pace again. We're down to, after this chapter, only one chapter left. I can hardly believe it. This one is chapter 22, and it's called When I'm Gone. And I will say that song is beautiful, but it's very hard for me to listen to. I will put it up, though. It's a beautiful song. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. That is Proverbs 25:2. And this chapter is When I'm Gone. Those first years that followed Mike's death were very difficult for me. I'd left my folks' home to marry when I was just 19, trying to get my hair fixed here. It's not helping. I'd never lived alone in my whole life. Mike and I moved in 2000 to a new home as well as to a new church so that we'd be near our grandkids. That was such a blessing because we were only like 2 miles from them. And Mike worked such long days. Had we not been so close, we wouldn't have been able to see near as much of the grandkids as we did. So it was a great blessing that we moved. But when Mike died, I was pretty isolated because even though we'd only moved 20 miles from where we'd lived all those years, 20 miles is significant as far as your day to day life. You don't run by each other's house. You don't say, hey, I'm out shopping, meet me for lunch. All those things that I was accustomed to, those were all gone. Overnight, with that shocking cancer diagnosis, I'd watched our dreams slowly crumble around us, and found myself living in our new home with the loudest silence I'd ever faced. I felt I was a stranger in a foreign country. Not only was Mike gone, but my sister was gone. Jan was on hospice. There was no normal for me to go back to anywhere in my life. Um, Even down to I didn't have a career. There was no job to go back to. Just so many things were just so very painful for me. And but God was faithful. He continued to meet me every step of the way. And that's how it works. It's not that we don't go through hard times because we do. And many of them are very painful. And this one for me was just extremely painful. I barely functioned at first. I lost weight because I'd forget to eat. That's something I had never done is forget to eat. Then I read a sweet writing by Elizabeth Elliot, and it helped me a lot. Elizabeth and her husband, Jim Elliot, were new parents and had just gone overseas as missionaries when her husband was murdered by the very natives that they were attempting to reach. There's a movie about that, by the way, The End of the Spear. She was in a foreign land with a new baby when suddenly she was widowed. I just can't even imagine. She found it very hard to function. She learned to ask herself, what is the next thing I need to do? Hour by hour, she'd ask herself that. Many times the answer was simple. It was change the baby, eat a meal. For me, I learned to ask myself that same question multiple times a day. And sometimes the answer was just as simple as eat lunch, pay the electric bill, go get the mail. And it was surprising to me, but asking myself that question really did help me to function. And so if you are grieving in really a hard place right now, you might try this little tip. It seems silly, but it did work for me because I had enough brain function that I could think, okay, here's what I need to do and get myself to go do it, tell myself to go do it. Then I was invited to grief share classes. And honestly, I didn't want to go because I had tried a grief share class when Jan suffered the brain damage, it wasn't grief share, but it was a class where parents of handicapped children could share. Well, I went to it and it was just a cry fest of why me, how bad everything is, all those kinds of things. And I didn't like it. I thought this is what this was going to be like. Everybody was going to shared their sob story, and I was handling all I could handle at that time myself. But I decided to go and see what it was like. And it's a 13-week course that has videos, and the videos are 13 weeks. And each video um, is just excellent. They take into account that you can't remember very well and you can't absorb much. I couldn't even read during this time. And they take that into account, and you have little snippets of people like Johnny Erickson or Billy Graham or Anne Graham, or hundreds just of people by the time you've seen the 13 weeks. And they're all telling you a little snippet of their grief and how they got through it. It's upbeat, it's positive. And that first 13 weeks, I will say, it made me feel like I fit somewhere, because the rest of the world was going on like normal. And in this little sanctuary, everyone in there had gone through a loss. They may have lost a child, they may have lost a parent. They all were going through loss, and their worlds had stopped too. And so it was a great place for me to be at that time. And so I took it 4 times, 13 weeks, then I'd re-enlist. And each time I gathered more tools for the healing of my heart. It also afforded me the opportunity to meet other widows who were my age, because I was 52. I didn't know any other widows my age. Most of the women that I knew that were widows were my mom's age, or they were in their 60s, and they were just in different spots because a lot of their friends were also widowed. None of my friends had been widowed yet. I was the first among my friends that I know of. So it helped me to not feel so alone. And I'm still friends with many of those ladies today because we walked through a real hard spot together. And the Grief Share video takes into account, I've already told you this, but that grieving people have short attention spans. And if you would consider checking into a Grief Share, you can Google it. You can put your zip code in. They'll give you a form, and you can find out if there are any of those classes near you. And there's also one that's called Divorce Care, and I've heard that it is equally as good. And so should you be walking in one of these areas of grief, that's something you can do for yourself to help you get past it. And it helped me so much that I remember the second 13 weeks, about toward the end of it, all of a sudden I realized that I'd been walking forward. By then it was over half a year, still holding on to Mike's hand, trying to pull him with me. And I remember that night letting go, because I realized, that life is gone and I have to learn a new life, a new language. And though I cried, it also freed me somewhat to get on with my healing. And so, don't know if you're there. I think my grief was compounded, I don't know, but compounded by the fact that we had fought so for Jan for so many years that it was like, I think I thought there would be that time where it just got to be me and Mike. And to a degree, that never happened. And that was another grief on top of that. So all of our grief is different for everyone. I learned during those days that there was no easy shortcut to heal from pain. After all, I had to learn a whole new life because half of mine was gone. I tried to rush it by moving to a different house. And, everything you read says don't make any major decisions in a year. But I thought I knew better. At the house that we had just moved to in 2000, I could still hear Mike shuffling down the hall. I could see him on our bed at night where he, was suffered from the cancer. And I just ran from that. I wanted to get away from it. And moving wasn't a good idea, but, it kept me busy. I learned gradually that single or widow was an unwanted title I had to learn to embrace. I didn't want to embrace it. And I'm sure if you're in whatever shoes you're in, whether it's the loss of a child or whatever it is, you don't want to embrace that either because we don't want those shoes. But the truth is, those are our shoes. And so God has equipped us with what we need to learn to walk in the place that we're at. As I watched the grief share videos, I realized many things had brought me grief throughout my lifetime, grief that I had never identified. I had grieved when I moved from Mississippi. And I don't think I really identified that as grief. I called it homesickness, but it was a grief. It was having to learn a whole new life and moving past what I had known my whole life. That's grief. I'd grieved when I saw my childhood home grow musty and in disrepair. I remember the first time I went home and Mother no longer lived there. She lived in a duplex. And that house had been shut up for a while. And Ben was with me, and we went out there with her to look through some things. In fact, I think it's the day I found my treasured Christmas ornament from the farm. But we started at the outbuildings. Then we walked toward the house. Mother unlocked it. And when she unlocked that door and swung it open, roly-polies and leaves and musty smell hit me in the face. And she and Ben walked out, and I took off running as hard as I could to get away so I could cry. That was grief, but I didn't know that was grief. And I grieved terribly with the placement of Jan. I didn't identify it as grief either, but it was grief akin to what I felt when Mike died, just not near as bad as what I felt when Mike died. And we had grieved when Mike's diagnosis came. I hadn't recognized that as grief either. But anytime you get a life-changing event, and like I say, it can be your dog dying, it can be financial despair, it can be any number of things, you will grieve. And if we can recognize it as grief, then we can understand ourselves so much better. It can be a wayward child. We grieve when our expectations are changed for the bad, not for the good. And so it's okay. It's normal that we grieve, but it will help you if you look up some of the symptoms of grief, I think is what I'm trying to say, because grief is hard. I looked back as I was learning all about grief to one Sunday morning in 1984. I gazed over the congregation after two couple friends, the kind that stick closer than a brother. And I will say that was my friend Gay and that was my friend Gail. They moved within 2 weeks of one another. They were my dearest friends. I felt their absence so keenly that I would sit in church for the first few Sundays and I'd look across the congregation and I'd cry. I didn't recognize I was grieving their absence. Identifying those emotions called grief helped me understand myself and my life journey in such a better way. As people, we grieve so many other things than death. The loss of a job, loss of health, kind of covered this, but loss of friendships, loss of abilities, loss of dreams, any major thing that happens, like moves or unexpected twists in our lives that take our lives in a different direction. The list is long, and it does help to recognize those emotions connected to grief. And I will say, as many of you know, John had a failed heart surgery. It's now been 9 years ago. And at that time, it just failed totally in 11 weeks after the triple bypass. And he was worse in 11 weeks than he was before he had the surgery. And they said they couldn't do anything. And so we found a way of eating called forks over knives, meaning what you put on your fork keeps you from having to undergo surgery. And we began to eat that very strictly. I threw out mayonnaise and all kinds of things that were on our regular diet, eggs. And do you know, John got better and better, and he has done very well as we've eaten this way. But the heart was still in not getting enough oxygen. He was just helping it get its oxygen by how we ate. And so that's kind of caught up with us this last, I'd say, 8 weeks. And COVID caused an artery to fail, a bypass artery and our bypass vein. And he's having, he's on a lot of medication for pain, and he's having a lot of angina. And he just about at this time can't do anything. We've grieved that. It's been a hard grief because we don't know. It could pass. We don't think it will, but we don't know that because God's still on his throne and he's well able to help. And I'm telling you this so you will pray for us. And, but as for me, going back to the book, my hardest and most difficult grief at the time of the writing of this book was the loss of Mike. For me, it was like trudging through a deep and dark, never-ending tunnel, and it took me a long time to see light at the end of that tunnel. During that time, I faltered. I made mistakes as I tried in my own strength to find a place to belong and to fix the pain. I wanted to fix that. I wanted to get past it. I ran from it. And I ran from the extreme pain and hurt that I dealt with daily, as my hurting heart was more broken than I thought possible. Finally, I surrendered it all to God, and I stopped running, and I stopped trying to fix it myself. I found out that God doesn't waste our tears or our sorrows when we let them go and lay them at his feet. Here's a few of the things I jotted down that I learned during my hardest grief journey. And I know all of our grief is different, but the reason I write this is for if someone's listening that you're going through this right now, my desire is just help you not feel so alone. Grief can paralyze and cause temporary memory loss and forgetfulness. Mike died in 2003. In 2004, he left everything ready to do the taxes. And all I had to do was gather everything to take to our tax accountant. The only thing I hadn't realized is that I would be reliving that year of his death to get the stuff together. Doing those taxes or getting that stuff together to take to the accountant, I lay in the floor and cried and cried and cried. It was so difficult for me. And do you know, the next year, I had no memory of anything but the pain. I didn't remember any of the things the accountant told me how to do, where to find it. I had no memory of that, only the pain. So that's grief. Grief can be so heavy that you feel the weight of it. And that's the truth of it. Grief can bring a feeling of desperation because of the many gaping gaps left unfilled. I remember one day feeling desperate, and I couldn't figure out why, because I'm thinking I'm taken care of, I've got food, I still have my health, all of those things, and yet I felt this desperation. And then later I read something about that's normal when so many gaping holes are left in your life. You don't even know why you're feeling desperate. Grief can affect health, too little sleep or too much, weight loss or weight gain, heart palpitations, extreme fatigue. I couldn't eat much for several months and I became way too thin. I remember my nephew saying, Aunt Pam, you need to start eating. You're just entirely too thin. Well, I can't explain it other than at that point, I just could not eat. And again, that's different for everyone. But grief can do strange things to you. It brings ambushes when you least expect it. And I named those times when you suddenly, a memory, a thought, a smell, a song brings tears. I learned to name that. Oh, that was a grief ambush. I remember going in the grocery store to buy groceries, and I reached for something that I always bought for Mike. And I reached out for it, went to put it in my cart, and burst into tears because I knew I wouldn't eat that. That was an ambush. I've walked in a store before and a song that was really meaningful and reminded me of Mike was playing. Had to turn around and leave because I got ambushed. So it helps if you just recognize, okay, there was a grief ambush. It's all right. It's a part of healing. Grief and hard losses forever change us. We'll never be quite the same. We'll feel the absence of that presence, their presence, for the rest of our lives. But you know what? That's okay because they were a big part of our lives. Whoever you've lost, big part of our lives, and they enriched our lives in most cases. And so we will forever feel that absence. That's grief. Grief has purpose. God promised that he would work to our good what Satan meant for our evil, our downfall. I had to learn to trust God with that, knowing that he could work this hard to my good, and he can with you too. Grief is never without hope. I had to learn that. There was still hope. And there was, as a Christian, the fact that we will see our loved ones again, that's a huge hope and a huge promise. Grief should only be for a season. God doesn't want us stuck there. Have you ever met someone that when you first started to visit with them, you thought they had the loss of whoever they're talking about was, in the last year, maybe the last few months. And then as you continue to talk, you find out their mother died 25 years ago. That's called stuck in grief. We have to be deliberate about working through grief and moving past it. It's not giving up our love for that person. It's just an acceptance that I will see them again. It's like David in the Old Testament when his son died. He was grieving and he was in sackcloth and ashes. And then suddenly he gets up, he dusts himself off, and he says, one day I will go to him. And he gets back in life. That's kind of what we have to do. And we can choose not to do that. And we can live our life broken, missing all the blessings that we still have. But that doesn't profit anyone because, our kids, our grandkids, our friends are watching us. Mike showed me how to die by doing it with grace and a victory. And I want to live my life like that so that others can say, okay, I can get over this. I'm not, it's not that I'm not missing them and won't always miss them. It's that I believe God has purpose for me still, and that's why I'm still here. So we go forth, letting him continue to use us. So God equips us to be comforters. Perhaps this is one of the most beautiful and purposeful outcomes. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received. That is 1 Corinthians 1:2. So we see, I'm going to go over those things. Grief has purpose. Grief is never without hope. Grief should only be for a season. And grief equips us to be comforters. Those are the positive sides of grief. And those all come with a choice, I believe. Those four. We either choose to move on into this or we stay stuck. Thankfully, God was faithful every step of the way when I failed and when I got back on track. So many people helped me heal too. My dear friend, Brenda McEwen, called me every Sunday night for over 2 years. Her mom had been widowed at my age, 52, and she understood how hard it was. And I appreciated that so much. I looked forward to that call every Sunday night. Stephanie and Ben helped in multiple ways. All the first were hard, and Steph knew that because she had walked in grief. I flew to Mississippi by myself for the first time after Mike's death, and that meant I drove to the airport, which was 45 minutes away. I figured out how to leave my car in a rental place because I didn't want Ben and Stephanie with two little kids to have to come get me late at night. And then that meant when I flew back in, I had to negotiate my way to find my car and get back home. In fact, I got lost in the airport. I've always been directionally challenged. But when I got home from that first trip since Mike died, and I was coming in the house late at night, I think I didn't get home till 11:30 that night. And I was dreading coming into that empty house. I'd never done that before. If I went to Mississippi or I went out of town on something, Mike was always there when I got home. Do you know what she did? She took pictures of the boys and she made posters. And I mean, probably 12 by 12. And she put those pictures on there. She would have had to back then go to Kinko's probably. And then she wrote funny sayings. And she put them when I drove into the garage, there on the door going into the house was the first one. And it was, I still have them, but I can't remember without looking it up. And then I would have to find them. She knew where I'd walk and she had those posters. And pulling into that dark garage that night and seeing that, it blessed me so much in the midst of the pain. There was a bright light there, and so we can be that for someone. And Stephanie was that for me. God continued to minister me in the sweetest of ways. Below, I'll share several snippets of God's grace keeping pace. And again, when I was writing this, it was so much easier for me to just put snippets. It was less painful. I'll put it that way. So this snippet, His grace keeping pace that first Christmas. In pieces. It'd be my first Christmas in 33 years without Mike. I shopped for flowers for his new tombstone as others shopped for Christmas tree ornaments and decorations. I remember being in Hobby Lobby. I was there shopping for flowers for his grave. And I just looked around and everybody else was shopping, it seemed, for ornaments and wrapping. And it made me feel so alone. I sorted through the remnants of his life as others prepared for family get-togethers. At least that's how it felt to me. Surely I could do something constructive in the midst of this awful pain. When I walked into our closet, memories flooded my soul as I saw 5 of Mike's favorite shirts. They were big old heavy flannel shirts. When Ben was in college, in the early 90s, the big flannel shirt became the fashion craze. I purchased 2 or 3 of those big heavy shirts for Ben for Christmas. He was in college. They were great for wearing to class. Every time he came home for the weekend, Mike would walk into his closet and come out wearing one of those shirts with a kind of a mischievous smile. It became a joke. For the next several years, I brought Ben and Mike identical flannel shirts for Christmas. 10 years later, those shirts continued to be Mike's favorites. In fact, as he started chemo and had fever, he wore one of those almost every day. So when we headed into the holidays, I took those shirts off their hangers one by one. I hugged them close as I walked upstairs to my sewing room. I laid them in a corner. I wanted to do something special with them. Took a few days to get the courage to cut into them. I think dismantling them bore too much of a parallel to what had happened to our lives. I was determined to make a treasure for Ben out of them. I studied those shirts, crying all over them, and measured them. I saw I could get several 8-inch strips from the front and the back of the shirts, as well as from the sleeves. That was if I could bear to cut those shirts apart. I made myself proceed, crying the whole way. I cut the 8-inch strips first, and then I cut them into as many squares as I could get. Then I began to sew those squares back together, and a quilt slowly began to emerge. As friends looked at my work in progress, they commented on how great my color combination was. Well, I hadn't chosen the color. They were the shirts, and together they formed a beautiful coordinated palette. It seemed impossible to finish my project by Christmas, but I was determined I would do it. I wanted desperately to just have something special to give Ben, and I felt like this was it. I asked God to give me the strength to complete my project. Day by day, the quilt grew larger. I sewed the labels of the shirts on some of the squares and deliberately cut strips with pockets where the pockets were so that the pocket could be seen and that would be evident that it was made from shirts, from Mike's shirts. To finish the project, I bordered the quilt in navy flannel, quilted the shirts with my machine in a freehand motion style. I was able to move the quilt around under the needles so that I could stitch names. I stitched Whitley, 203, Mike, Pam, Ben, Steph, Jack, and Will into the borders of that quilt. I envisioned one day our grandsons searching for their names in the design, and Ben sharing fondly about those shirts. On Christmas Day, as our son opened his gift, tears welled up in his eyes. The look on his face blessed my heart. And the grandsons grew up loving Pawpaw Mike's blanket made from his flannel shirts. I knew God desired to do the same things with our lives. If we'd give him our shattered pieces, he would make us whole again. We'd have a new look and a new purpose, created from precious remnants of the past. And that's the truth. He'll take that which the devil meant for evil and meant to destroy us, and he'll put it back together in a different pattern, but he still wants to use our lives. And here's some tips for you for future keepsakes. Look for items of your loved one that can be repurposed treasures for you or your family. My boys have Papa Mike's old handkerchiefs, and I believe Jack, my grandson that just got married, carried one of those in his pocket when he got married. I made Stephanie a bookmark out of the remnants of her mom's things. We used, I think, even part of the lace came from a tablecloth of hers. We were limited in what we could find of hers, but we found enough to make a beautiful bookmark. She carried it in her Bible on her wedding day. I remember we found one of those. Do you remember there were charms? I think they were by Olin Mills. This will date me. This is to you older people like me. But it was charms that Olin Mills made for bracelets with the picture that you had made. Well, we found one with her mom in that little charm. They called it a charm. And I was able to sew that at the end of the bookmark. I made the bookmark a little rectangle at the end, and there was her mom's picture. That blessed me to create that. But look for items that can be used. I've seen leather boots, leather belts, leather purses, and wallets made into treasured keepsakes. One friend had her mom's leather purse cut into beautiful crosses for the wall, and they were very pretty. They were layered leather of different colors, and it was a very beautiful design of a cross. I wish I'd have thought of that because Mike had some wonderful leather cowboy boots. I would love to have something like that. I've seen Christmas favorite shirts made into pillows, quilts, teddy bears, or aprons. T-shirt quilts are quite nice too. I also made Ben a t-shirt quilt out of Mike's t-shirts. Write down precious memories for future generations. That will become a great treasure too. Celebrate your loved one's birthday each year by recalling special and sweet memories. I know someone who fixes their loved one's favorite dishes on the date of their homegoing. Keep the memories uplifting, though, and celebratory, not sad and weepy. Make special boxes of random things that they owned. I share an example below in a story. Have jewelry made from the loved ones copied signature or cards. I've seen that done where people have a bracelet and it has "I love you," but it's in the handwriting of a card they had. Um, have it embedded in a bracelet or necklace. I saw a friend the other day and she had on this beautiful necklace and I could tell it was a thumbprint. And I said, "Tell me about your necklace." And she said, "Well, where her mom died the last 2 years." And she said, "That's something they now do. They make jewelry using the fingerprint of a loved one." That was not something I'd ever seen done. I made ornaments from a tattered old quilt of my grandmother's to share with her grandchildren. I made an old piece together quilt top, and it had never been quilted and was not big enough to be a quilt, into a Christmas tree skirt that was from my mom's mom. I am very sentimental. I love that tree skirt, and I love things repurposed like that. Old costume jewelry can be made into numerous things. I had an old cultured pearl necklace of my mom's restrung into a new keepsake, and I wore it. It was my mom's that my dad gave her on their first anniversary, and it was, not real pearls, but they were good quality pearls, but it was so old. It's probably 60, 70 years old. At least, yeah, I'd say 70 years old. I was afraid to wear it because it was the strings were real loose, and I had it made into a beautiful necklace, and I wore it at my first grandson's wedding, and I just felt so good about having something my dad had gifted my mom that I was wearing at my their great grandson's wedding. I've seen old brooches grouped together on velvet to form a tree, like a Christmas tree, or to form a heart and then framed. I've seen that done with an antique button collection. Some of you will have button collection of your grandma's. It's healing to me to be creative in turning my loved ones' things into a treasure for future generations. It may be for you too. Don't get rid of things too quickly, because you may regret it. And I know someone that when their loved one died, family thought they were helping them by removing everything that would remind them of that loved one. Well, they should have boxed some of it up instead of just getting rid of all of it. And then here's a story of treasure boxes. When Mike died, I held on to a lot of what people would call junk, and friends would ask, "Why are you keeping that junk?" Sometimes I wondered myself, but since his death, I downsized my home by 1,700 square feet. Moving twice had forced me to sort through the remnants of our 30 years of marriage and give away office furniture, my husband's sports equipment, clothes, multitude of books, and many of his tools. I'd saved his collections and keepsakes and held on to a lot of seemingly silly things. I say silly because friends and family who had seen my can't part with stacks asked, "Why are you keeping that?" It couldn't possibly serve any purpose. But, if he had held on to it, his trinkets and things, there was something in me that wanted to hold on to it too. I crammed a unique assortment of things into purchase boxes. One was a black square box with a lid, and the other was a large lidded round cardboard box. I got them at Hobby Lobby. I stashed one in my closet, another in the guest room. Maybe one day my grandsons would enjoy some of the random trinkets those boxes contained and remember their grandpa. Kind of forgot about those boxes for a few years. Then one Friday night, about 5 years later, my 6-year-old grandson, Will, spent the night. I took him shopping and I let him pick out a toy. He chose a spy kit. Once home, we put the spy gadgets together and we created a game. I had an old rhinestone piece of jewelry in my closet, and I wrote out clues to help Will find it, and then I would go hide it. Armed with a new spy flashlight, he'd search for the loot, reading what I wrote out. I had to help him a little bit at 5 to read it. During his hunt, he discovered one of those stashed boxes of stuff of Grandpa Mike's. He's fascinated by it. 3 old watches, key rings loaded with once purposeful keys, golf balls, a coin-filled medicine bottle, 6 antique cigarette lighters that were from Mike's granddad's, a variety of other things from old cufflinks to tie tacks to bullets. Will spent an hour looking at those items, asking about each one. He'd never seen a cigarette lighter, so many things. And he was just, he was captivated by it. He looked up at me, his eyes just sparkling, and said, Mimi, do you have more treasure boxes? That just blessed me so much. Smiling, I led him to the guest room and I revealed the second box. It delighted him even more. It held a variety of pocket knives, a letter opener, a little set of tools, old belt buckles, his grandpa's engineering calculator, and 2 items that particularly fascinated him: old wind-up alarm clocks. Who would have thought? He explored the contents for another hour, and then he wanted to look in the other treasure box again. The next morning, when his mom arrived to pick him up, he immediately said to his 3-year-old brother, Mimi has treasure boxes. You want to see? He proudly took his brother to look at the newfound treasures. As I pondered how enchanted my grandsons were with those 2 boxes, I was so glad I'd saved that seemingly frivolous stuff. Papa Mike's old collection turned out to be a little boy's treasure and delight, and it had been Grandpa's too. It did have purpose. Lord, help us to recognize the seemingly useless parts of my life that you can use and you want to use. May I give them all to you and allow you to repurpose them into treasure to bless others. Another story, His Grace Keeping Pace at Easter. The week before Easter, 204, was filled with delightful spring weather, but Saturday dawned with a chilling drizzle and dense fog. From my warm spot in bed, I turned the TV to the Weather Channel. The weatherman predicted a freeze for the night. Reluctantly, I shoved back my warm, fuzzy comforter and slipped out of bed. Grief was still hanging on to me like a wet blanket. Walking to the windows, I peeked through the blinds and I shivered as the Oklahoma winds pounded the cold rain against the glass. I felt pretty much like the day looked, gray and dismal. This would be my first Easter in 33 years without Mike. He died of cancer 6 months earlier, and all of my first since his death had been painful. His birthday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Valentine's Day, my birthday, and now Easter. And many of you identify totally with this because you've been there. The absence of his presence was excruciating and tainted each celebration. Pulling on my robe, I walked to the kitchen to make coffee. I peered at the gloomy day as the wind whined around the corner of the house. My gaze settled on Mike's vacant chair at the kitchen table. I dreaded this holiday. I didn't look forward to the empty space that would be beside me in tomorrow's Easter service either. My mind skipped to lunch. I'd prepare for my son and his family, and to the treasures I planned for our grandbaby's Easter baskets. Last year, Mike had delighted in hiding the Easter eggs and carving the ham. Tears welled up in my eyes. Oh Lord, will I ever be content without Mike? I poured my cup of coffee, returned to my bedroom. Plumping the pillows against the headboard, I crawled back under the warm covers. I grabbed my Bible. I turned to Psalms and read verse 10. The first verse touched my heart so much. Oh Lord, why do you stand so far away? Why do you hide when I am in trouble? That is Psalm 10:1. I read it again and I thought, Lord, I feel just like this. You seem so far away. I just don't understand why I'm walking here. Though I wanted to pull the covers over my head and stay in bed, I knew I'd better get ahead of the holiday crowds and buy the groceries for the Easter meal. I exchanged my Bible for a notepad, listing the things I still needed. Then I pulled my jeans on, grabbed my umbrella, and headed to the store. Once again, I missed Mike terribly. We typically went out for breakfast on the Saturday mornings that he was off. and then we'd drive to Sam's Wholesale Club. That was his favorite store. The trip concluded at the Sam's gas station as Mike put gas in my car. He insisted on pumping the gas long after brain tumors rendered him unable to drive. Today I thought, I'll get the gasoline first since my gauge was near empty. As I pulled in the pump area, my cell phone rang. With the distraction, I failed to see that I pulled into the one pump area where two young people stood, a guy and a girl. Oh, I looked up and I thought, great, just what I need. Someone who wants money to wash my windshield. Maybe I could back up, but I glanced back. Two cars had already pulled behind me. So it was too late. I fumbled through my wallet for my Sam's card, braced myself for their sales pitch as I stepped out of the car. Good morning, the young woman cheerfully handed me a business card that had her church info on it. We're here on behalf of Real Church. Her brown eyes sparkled, and she pointed across the street to their building as her long brown hair blew in the wind. We're here to tell you that God loves you. We want to fill your gas tank for free. I was shocked. I protested, oh, sweetie, I'm a Christian. I love the Lord. I don't want you to spend your money on me. Please use the money for the next car. And she said emphatically, you're exactly who we want to do this for. I hesitated. I sat back down in the car, leaving my door partially open. They swiped their credit card, and the young man pumped my gas. This is so kind of you and your church, I said. Our congregation wanted to do something special this Easter for the neighborhood. One of our members had this idea and donated the money, the young woman said with a smile as she pushed her wind-tossed hair out of her face again. We'll fill up tanks until the money is gone. Whoops. We want to tell as many people as possible that God loves you. I thought back to the psalm I read that morning. I recalled my statement to God about him being so far away, and I started to cry right there, sitting in the car, getting my gas tank filled for free. I looked at the young man and I said, I want you to know that God sent you to stand in my husband's shoes today. My voice quivered as I struggled to get out the rest of my words. My husband died last fall, and this is my first Easter without him. He'd normally be pumping the gas for me today. You'll never know what your kind gesture just meant to me. Mom, ma'am, I'm honored to have this privilege, he said as his voice broke. I hugged them both before I drove away. The day no longer seemed dreary. I knew God wasn't hiding from me. He was waiting to bless me through two messengers stationed at a gas pump with his message, I love you. It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. That's Deuteronomy 31:8. Lord, thank you that you never leave or forsake us. You were there in the dark and dismal days, waiting to fill us up again. We just have to look for him. His grace keeping pace, the second Christmas without mine. Would I ever enjoy, here I go back, my sad story again. Would I ever enjoy a holiday again? The year before, I'd skipped the Christmas services at our church because it was my first holiday without mine. He had died in August, and all the firsts were difficult. I thought the second year would be easier, and I attended that service with my son and his family. Seated in the audience beside me, I looked at the beautiful scene before me. The stage was filled with hundreds of white candles flickering against a backdrop of numerous lighted Christmas trees. It was a beautiful sight. Carols that I usually love to hear played in the background. My focus wasn't on the beautiful occasion, but rather on the couple-filled church and the empty seat beside me. That empty spot seemed to shout that Mike was gone. The joy and wonder of his The birth of Christ normally caused my heart to soar, but not on this night. I felt very alone without Mike, and the service brought more pain than joy to my grief-stricken heart. I struggled to hold back the tears and ask God to help me find joy again. I was glad when the service was over. After the service, Ben and Stephanie rushed to get my two grandchildren from the nursery. We would head home to share our Christmas Eve meal together. When we picked up the 19-month-old, it was obvious that he was very cranky. This is one that was born 3 months, born 3 months before Mike died. It was well past his dinner time, and he was not only hungry, but he was tired. As soon as we were in the car and buckled him into the car seat, his fussiness increased. It looked like it was going to be a long ride home. In an effort to calm him, my son said, "Will, tell Mimi what the lion says." Will growled in the deepest voice he could muster, "Eat." And we all giggled. That delighted Will. Will, tell Mimi what the sheep says. "Eat, eat, eat," was the next thing that he bladed out. And the smile on his face said volumes when we all laughed and giggled, and it trumped his tired and hungry. "Will, tell Mimi what the dog says." Will barked out, "Eat, eat, eat." Soon I was laughing so hard that tears spilled down my face. The entertainment and laughter lasted the whole trip. By the time we arrived home, my spirit was much lighter, and for the first time in a long while, joy had inched its way back into my heart, into our celebration too. I gave Will a big hug as we walked inside and quickly breathed a prayer of thanksgiving, not only for my precious grandchild, but for my loving Father who heard my prayer and answered it in a very unexpected way. His grace keeping pace and change. In 207, of remembering that Mike died in 203, Ben accepted a job opportunity that moved him and his family to Owasso, Oklahoma. It's a town just outside of Tulsa and was 117 miles from where I lived in Edmond. By then, boy number 4 had arrived, and I adored them all. I made that drive so often that my kids invited me to move to Owasso. I took them up on that invitation, and I moved in 209. I told Ben then, if anything, if he was anything like his dad, um, Mike was always very ambitious job wise, and I thought you may wind up wanting to change careers. I told him that I wanted him to know the fact that I moved to Owasso, I didn't want him to ever feel like he couldn't change careers or move. I just didn't, I knew that that was a possibility, and I took that into account when I did move. And that was in 2010. Ben had a wonderful opportunity to make a major career change. It involved many weeks of training hundreds of miles away from home. He graduated from his program in the fall and began a new career that involved law enforcement. I was thankful I was in Owasso during those 20 weeks that Ben was away, because Stephanie had 4 little boys, and I delighted in being able to help with them, and I enjoyed every grandma moment I got. But when Ben graduated, his new career path led him to move across the country. The week before they moved, it sunk in that Ben, my only remaining child, could be in harm's way. I was suddenly, when I really contemplated that and thought about it, I was suddenly filled with fear and anxiety. And once again, I cried out to God, just with laying out how petrified I was that my only son was going to be in harm's way. And I felt like God said, "Look in Ben's high school classroom." I really felt that impression. And my first thought was, well, I have no idea where his high school ring is. I felt God impress on my heart once again. Yes, you do, Pam. Is in the wooden jewelry box in the guest bedroom. Oh, I realized that they had moved all their valuables to our house before the house started showing. And their jewelry box was in that bedroom. So I walked in, I opened it. On top lay Ben's high school class ring. I picked it up and I held it in the light. At the time Ben ordered his high school class ring, he had planned to become a lawyer, but he changed his mind while in college. Engraved in that stone was an emblem of the scales of justice. It was an identical emblem to the emblem now imprinted on Ben's badge. I'd seen that badge when he graduated. And I cried for a while because I I didn't remember that. God remembered that. God knew that. After I'd cried for a while, I thanked God over and over for his faithfulness. My anxiety vanished. God was in control. God is in control. And I knew no matter what, I could trust him with it all. The class ring was another of his graces, keeping pace with his mama's anxious heart. He is, after all, the name above every name. And I didn't realize this chapter was so long. There's still another one of his graces keeping pace in my future. When I initially moved to Owasso in 2009, I wanted to find a ladies' Sunday school class. I called the church where I had planned to attend to ask about one. They gave me a name, Linda Malone. I called her. Linda told me about her wonderful Sunday school class. She invited me to it, but then she added, but it's not a ladies' class, it's a singles class. Well, I didn't want to be in a singles class, and I told Linda that. I said, well, I'm sorry, but I'm looking for a ladies' class. I don't want a singles class. But she insisted that I wanted to be in her class. She had lost a daughter, and she was widowed as well, and she just loved her class. Soon she had me wanting to meet the people that she loved. She told me about different ones who had had different losses and it just sounded like a perfect place for me. I visited and I loved it and I joined. That class was exactly what my hurting heart needed. After morning and evening church services, we usually all went out to eat together or to someone's house. Our motley crew was made up of widowed and divorced singles, as well as a couple of married couples who had once walked in our single shoes, and they mentored us and watched over us. For those of us who lived alone and had little or no family near, this class met so many needs. The meals shared together were lifelines for those of us who now ate most of our meals alone. On a Sunday evening in May of 2010, one of the married couples brought a single gentleman with them to another of our after church get-togethers. His name was John, and over barbecue brisket, I asked him about his slight West Coast brogue. He said he'd moved to Oklahoma from California in 1992. He was born and raised in Barbados and moved to California when he was 9. He returned the following Sunday to our groups, and he soon became one of our regulars. From then on, he and I visited from time to time in Sunday school and over meals as our class continued to dine together. As Christmas approached, I thought of how hard the holidays must be for him, and before I knew it, I'd invited him via private message on Facebook for a home-cooked meal. As soon as I sent out that invite, I thought, what in the world have I done? And I looked, is there any way to reel that request back in? He accepted my invitation, and months later he told me he was just as nervous as I was when he answered yes. Funny, he had not wanted to be in a singles class either. When the evening arrived for that meal, I was a basket case. What had I done, inviting him to have dinner with me? As I tried to cook that meal, I was so nervous. It literally took 3 trips to the grocery store to get all the ingredients. That was the funniest thing. On the first trip, I left one whole bag of groceries at the checkout. The next trip was made to pick up that bag. Then back at home, when I started to really fix my recipe, I realized I hadn't bought the chicken. I didn't have chicken to make this recipe that called for chicken. That third crazy trip to the grocery store left me barely enough time to get the meal prepared. Oh my. Over that meal, John and I talked and talked. Our stories were similar, lots of heartache and loss. Soon we were talking often on the phone and sharing almost every meal together. By March of 2011, we were engaged, and in April, we traveled to Mississippi so we could meet my mom and my brother before our May wedding. My mom was 97 at the time. She'd suffered a stroke when she was 92, and we'd sorted through her belongings as she opted to move into a nursing facility. Her few remaining belongings were stored in the boxes at my grandparents' old farmhouse where my dad had grown up. My brother had redone that place, and he owned that land, and he used that house as a place for our families together. He lived about 50 miles away, and so that was very handy when we came into town. It was a delightful place to visit. It was filled with memories. And on this visit, my brother graciously pulled his fifth will to the property for John to stay in, and I stayed with my brother and his wife in the farmhouse. The next day, we brought Mother out to the farm. We shared a meal together as everyone became acquainted. In the midst of our visit, my mom asked me to fetch her a hairbrush from one of her stored boxes. When I reached into the box, I also found an old scarf that my brother had sent to Mother in 1969. It was a scarf with the island of Barbados stamped on it. You see, my brother Jerry was assigned a 4-month stint in Barbados when I was a senior in high school. Mother had moved 4 times since that 42-year-old present came into her life. She'd left the farm, moved to the duplex, then to a 1-bedroom apartment, then to a nursing facility. Every item she owned had been carefully sifted through, and the few items that remained resided in these boxes. I can't imagine what the odds were that she'd still have a Barbados scarf, but there it was. I was so surprised that I cried as I brought it out to show my fiance from Barbados and my mom. I believe God knew before the foundation of the world that in their twilight years of grief, a Mississippi girl would meet a Barbados boy, and he'd bless them with something that linked their past. What a sweet and dear blessing from our Heavenly Father. Thank you, precious Lord. John and I were married in 2011, and we will celebrate 11 years of marriage in May of 2022. We did celebrate 11 years of marriage. God is so faithful in His graces. And here is the picture of my grandsons on the blanket that has all of Mike's shirts. The oldest one is pointing to a pocket that he sees. And so I didn't realize that chapter was so long. It was long, but it lifts my spirits to read it, because as we're going through this hard time with John, my God is faithful. This life is never going to be easy. It's going to have hard places, but the best is yet to be. And I hang my hat on that, saying, if you don't know Jesus Christ, you're missing the greatest adventure of your life, and you're missing the greatest peace that's available to you. So if you haven't invited him into your life, he is only a prayer away. All you've got to do is say, for God so loved the world, He gave His only Son, and I'm one of those whosoevers. And Lord, I want your Son in my heart. Forgive me for my sins. And Lord, I'm turning my eyes to you for my salvation. And you know what? He'll save you. So if you haven't ever prayed that, today's your day. For a minute, I thought I had not recorded, and I was going, as long as this was, oh my goodness, but it looks like I did. So hopefully the whole thing recorded. Thank you. God bless you.